The soft buzz of the cafe wrapped around Mark like a cocoon, but it did little to steady his nerves. He glanced down at his phone, the faint glow of the screen displaying a message that had been etched into his mind since the moment it arrived. Looking forward to catching up. It's been too long. Derek. Too long. Those two words hung heavy in his chest, pulling him back to a time when the line between admiration and attraction had blurred. Derek had been more than just a boss. He had been a force, calm yet commanding, with a way of filling every room he entered. Mark had spent 2 years under his mentorship, learning not just about work, but about himself. And then, one day, he'd left it all behind. "Mark?" The voice cut through his thoughts, low and smooth, yet edged with a warmth that sent a jolt through him. He looked up, his breath catching as he met Derek's gaze for the first time in almost a year. The older man stood before him, his tailored suit immaculate as always, but it was the softness in his eyes that held Mark captive. "Derek," Mark said, his voice tighter than he intended. He rose awkwardly, his chair scraping against the floor, and offered a small, nervous smile. "It's good to see you." Derek smiled back, the kind of smile that seemed to say more than it should. "Likewise," he said, reaching out to clasp Mark's hand in a firm shake. The touch lingered just a moment too long, and when Derek pulled away, Mark felt the absence like a phantom weight. They settled at the small table, the cafe's hum creating a private bubble around them. Derek leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp, like he was taking in every detail of Mark. The way his hair fell slightly messier than before, the way his hands fidgeted with the edge of the menu. "You've changed," Derek said, his voice quiet but certain. It wasn't a question, and Mark wasn't sure how to respond. "I guess I have," he said finally, his fingers brushing against the edge of his coffee cup. "It's been a while." Derek nodded, his eyes never leaving Mark. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to meet." Mark hesitated, the unspoken tension between them thick enough to cut. "Why wouldn't I?" Derek's lips quirked into a faint smile, the kind that always seemed to carry secrets. "Because I wasn't the easiest person to work with." "You were demanding," Mark said, a small laugh escaping him. "But you weren't unfair. And yet you left." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that made Mark's chest tighten. He opened his mouth to respond, but Derek held up a hand, cutting him off gently. "I'm not blaming you," Derek said, his tone softening. "If anything, I should be thanking you. Losing you made me realize I wasn't as untouchable as I thought." Mark's throat tightened, the honesty in Derek's voice catching him off guard. He searched for something to say, but nothing felt right. Instead, he found himself meeting Derek's gaze again, the intensity there leaving him breathless. "Why did you really ask me here?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, closing the distance between them. "Because I missed you," he said simply. The words struck Mark like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening as Derek's gaze burned into him, unrelenting yet tender. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the waitress appeared, placing their drinks on the table with a practiced smile. Derek leaned back, his expression shifting back to polite neutrality, but the air between them remained charged, every unspoken word hanging in the balance. The waitress left, her cheery smile doing little to cut through the heavy atmosphere that had settled between them. Derek's fingers played idly with the edge of his coffee cup, his movements deliberate, as though he were giving Mark space to speak first. But Mark couldn't. The weight of Derek's admission, "Because I missed you," wrapped around him, suffocating and electrifying in equal measure. Mark cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I didn't think you'd even notice I was gone," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. His eyes darted to Derek's face, half hoping for a denial, half terrified of what he might see. Derek's gaze snapped back to him, sharp and unyielding. "Why would you think that?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. You, Mark said lamely, gesturing vaguely. You always seemed so in control, like nothing could shake you. Derek let out a soft laugh, the sound low and bitter. Mark, control is just another word for pretending not to feel. He leaned forward again, his elbows resting on the table as his eyes bore into Mark's. And when you left, I felt it. Every single day. Mark's pulse quickened, his breath hitching as Derek's words settled over him. He wasn't sure what he'd expected from this lunch. Polite conversation, maybe some reminiscing about their time working together, but this was something else entirely, something he hadn't prepared for. You never said anything, Mark whispered. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup, the ceramic warm against his skin. Derek's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I couldn't, he said simply. Not when you worked for me. It would have crossed too many lines. Mark's stomach twisted at the quiet truth in Derek's words. He thought back to those long nights in the office, just the two of them hunched over reports and deadlines. He'd always chalked up the tension between them to stress, to the natural friction of a demanding work environment. But now, looking at Derek, he wasn't so sure. Did you ever? Mark started, then hesitated. He took a shaky breath and tried again. Did you ever think about saying something? All the time, Derek admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But you were young, bright. You had so much ahead of you, and I couldn't be the thing that held you back. Mark swallowed hard, the vulnerability in Derek's voice cutting through his defenses. He wanted to respond, to say something that would make sense of the whirlwind of emotions crashing through him, but he couldn't find the words. The cafe seemed to shrink around them, the chatter of other patrons fading into the background. Derek's hand moved just slightly, brushing against the edge of the table. The motion drew Mark's gaze like a magnet, his breath catching as Derek's fingers inched closer. Mark, Derek said softly, his voice a thread pulling Mark's attention back to his face. You can walk away from this. Right now. If this is too much, if I'm crossing a line, just say the word. Mark's chest tightened. The out Derek was offering hung between them, a fragile lifeline he wasn't sure he wanted to take. His mind screamed at him to be rational, to put up walls and protect himself, but his body betrayed him. He stayed rooted in place, unable to look away from Derek's steady gaze. I don't want to walk away, Mark said finally, the words spilling out before he could stop them. His voice trembled, but there was no mistaking the certainty in it. Derek's expression softened, a flicker of relief crossing his face. Then let me be honest with you, he said. I didn't just ask you to lunch to catch up. Mark's stomach churned, anticipation and fear swirling together in a volatile mix. Why did you? Because I wanted to see you, Derek said. Because I couldn't stop thinking about you, and because I needed to know if you felt it too. Mark's breath caught. His fingers dug into the edge of the table as he fought to process Derek's words. There was no ambiguity, no hiding behind polite formalities. Derek had laid everything bare, leaving Mark with no choice but to confront the truth he'd been avoiding for so long. Mark hesitated, his throat tightening. He wanted to say yes, to admit that he'd felt the same pull, the same unshakable connection that had lingered even after he'd left the company. But the words stuck, tangled in a web of fear and uncertainty. Derek seemed to sense his hesitation. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against Mark's in a light, deliberate touch. The contact sent a jolt through Mark, his breath hitching as Derek's fingers lingered, warm and steady against his skin. You don't have to say anything, Derek said softly. Not now. Not ever, if you're not ready. The kindness in his voice, the quiet patience, broke something inside Mark. He looked up, meeting Derek's gaze, and in that moment, he knew there was no going back. I felt it too, Mark whispered, his voice shaking but firm. I still feel it. Derek's hand tightened around Mark's, his thumb brushing against his knuckles in a slow, deliberate motion. The tension between them was electric, every unspoken word crackling in the air. "Then let me show you something," Derek said, his voice low and steady. He stood, pulling Mark to his feet with him, his grip strong yet gentle. Mark's heart pounded as Derek led him out of the cafe, the world outside a blur. He didn't know where they were going, didn't know what would happen next, but he didn't care. All that mattered was the warmth of Derek's hand in his, the unrelenting pull that had brought them to this moment. The cool air outside hit Mark's face like a shock, but it wasn't enough to steady the storm raging within him. Derek's hand remained firmly around his own as they stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, the clamor of the city a distant hum compared to the pounding of his heart. Every step they took felt heavy with meaning, the silence between them more potent than words could ever be. Mark tried to focus on the rhythm of their footsteps, the way Derek's grip on his hand was steady but not overbearing, but his mind kept circling back to one question. What happens now? Derek led him around the corner, away from the crowd, toward a quieter street lined with brick buildings and tree canopies that whispered in the wind. The world seemed to narrow, the noise of the city fading until it was just the two of them. Finally, Derek stopped in front of a modest brownstone, his keys jingling softly as he pulled them from his pocket. "This is me," Derek said, his voice calm but laced with something unspoken, something vulnerable. Mark stared at the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He hadn't asked where they were going, hadn't questioned Derek's quiet determination, but now that they were here, the enormity of it hit him. Crossing this threshold would change everything. "You don't have to come in," Derek said gently, turning to face him. His eyes searched Mark's face, his expression open and unguarded in a way that made Mark's chest ache. "But if you do, I want it to be your choice." Mark hesitated, his thoughts racing. He could feel the line between them, the one that had been there since the first day they'd met, since Derek had shaken his hand and welcomed him to the company. Crossing it would mean leaving behind everything safe and familiar, diving headfirst into something messy and uncertain. But the thought of walking away felt unbearable. "I want to," Mark said, his voice barely audible but filled with conviction. Derek's lips curved into a faint smile and he pushed the door open, stepping aside to let Mark in. The hallway inside was warm and inviting, the soft glow of a table lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Derek closed the door behind them, the click of the lock reverberating through the quiet space like a heartbeat. Mark followed Derek into the living room, his eyes darting around to take in the details. The leather couch, the bookshelf crammed with novels and framed photos, the faint scent of cedar and something distinctly Derek. It felt intimate, like stepping into a part of Derek he hadn't known existed. "Make yourself comfortable," Derek said, his voice breaking the silence. He moved toward the kitchen, his movements fluid and unhurried. "Can I get you something? Water? Wine?" "Water's fine," Mark said, his throat dry. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he tried to calm the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. The faint clink of glasses from the kitchen felt like the only tether to reality, a small reminder that this was real, that he was here. Derek returned a moment later, a glass of water in each hand. He handed one to Mark before sitting beside him, close enough that their knees brushed. The contact sent a jolt through Mark, but he didn't move away. They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with anticipation. Mark could feel Derek's gaze on him, could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the space between them. "I don't know what I'm doing," Mark admitted finally, his voice trembling. Derek set his glass down on the coffee table, turning to face Mark fully. "Neither do I," he said softly. "But I know what I want." Mark's breath hitched as Derek reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against Mark's cheek. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it made Mark's chest tighten with something he couldn't name. "I've wanted this for so long," Derek murmured, his hand lingering on Mark's skin. "But I didn't think I'd ever have the chance." Mark closed his eyes, leaning into the touch despite the fear clawing at the edges of his mind. "I was scared," he admitted. "Still am." "Me too," Derek said. His thumb traced a slow, soothing line along Mark's jaw. "But that doesn't mean it's wrong." The words hung between them, a fragile truth that neither of them dared to break. Derek leaned in slowly, giving Mark every opportunity to pull away. But Mark didn't. When their lips met, it was soft, tentative, a question more than an answer. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, as Derek's hand slid from Mark's cheek to the back of his neck, pulling him closer. Mark's hands found their way to Derek's chest, clutching at the fabric of his shirt as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Time seemed to blur, the world outside fading into nothingness. All that existed was the warmth of Derek's body, the steady rhythm of his breath, the way his touch seemed to ignite something deep within Mark. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together as they tried to steady themselves. Derek's hand moved to Mark's back, his touch firm but comforting. "Are you okay?" Derek asked, his voice low and rough. Mark nodded, his chest tightening as he met Derek's gaze. "Yeah," he said softly. "I am." Derek's lips curved into a small smile, and he pulled Mark closer, holding him in a way that felt protective, almost possessive. They stayed like that for a long moment, the quiet between them filled with unspoken promises. "I don't want to rush you," Derek said finally, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "We can take this as slow as you need." Mark swallowed hard, his hands tightening on Derek's shirt. "I don't want slow," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I've waited long enough." Derek's smile widened, his eyes darkening with something that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. "Neither do I," he said, his voice a low rumble. And when he kissed Mark again, it was with a hunger that left no room for doubt. Derek's hands moved with a deliberate confidence that sent sparks racing through Mark's skin, every touch a wordless declaration that demanded nothing but gave everything. Mark found himself clinging to Derek's shoulders, his breath hitching as the older man pulled him closer, their bodies aligning with a seamless urgency that felt both overwhelming and inevitable. Time seemed to dissolve, the quiet hum of the city outside and the soft lamplight within fading into irrelevance. All that mattered was the warmth of Derek's presence, the steady rhythm of his touch, the way his lips moved against Mark's as though he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. Derek shifted, his hands sliding from Mark's back to his waist, guiding him with a tenderness that belied the intensity of the moment. "Are you sure?" he murmured, his breath ghosting against Mark's cheek. Mark nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. Derek's eyes searched his, dark and intense, as if seeking confirmation in the depths of Mark's soul. Then, with a soft exhale, he leaned in again, his kiss deepening into something raw and consuming. Mark melted into it, his hands threading through Derek's hair as he let himself be swept away by the tidal wave of emotion. They moved together with an unspoken rhythm, their connection transcending words. Every touch, every breath, every shared glance felt like a piece of a puzzle falling into place, as though they'd been circling this moment for years without even realizing it. Derek's hands roamed with a deliberate reverence, memorizing every curve and contour, while Mark responded with equal fervor, his inhibitions melting away under the weight of Derek's touch. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths came in ragged gasps, their foreheads pressed together as they clung to each other. Derek's hands framed Mark's face, his thumbs brushing gently against his cheekbones. "I didn't know it could feel like this," Derek whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Mark swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "Neither did I," he admitted. but I don't want it to stop." Derek's lips curved into a faint smile, his gaze softening as he studied Mark's face. "It doesn't have to," he said. "Not unless you want it to." Mark shook his head, his hands gripping Derek's shirt tightly. "I don't." The reassurance seemed to ease something in Derek, and he pulled Mark into a tight embrace, his arms wrapping around him as though he were afraid to let go. They stayed like that for a long moment, the world outside fading into insignificance as they held on to each other. Eventually, Derek shifted, his hands moving to Mark's shoulders as he leaned back just enough to meet his gaze. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like," he said, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "But I know I want you in it." Mark's chest tightened at the quiet honesty in Derek's words. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Instead, he reached up, his fingers brushing lightly against Derek's cheek in a silent promise. Derek smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made Mark's heart ache. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to Mark's forehead before pulling him close again, his chin resting on Mark's shoulder. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, as the minutes stretched into something timeless. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt a sense of peace, as though he'd finally found the place he belonged. When the night eventually gave way to quiet conversation, their connection only deepened. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden for far too long. Derek's laughter was a low rumble that sent warmth flooding through Mark's chest, while Mark's quiet confessions drew an intensity to Derek's gaze that left him breathless. By the time the first rays of dawn began to filter through the curtains, they were lying together on the couch, their bodies tangled in a comfortable intimacy that felt both new and familiar. Derek's hand rested lightly on Mark's chest, his thumb tracing absent patterns against his skin. "You're not going to regret this, are you?" Mark asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek lifted his head, his gaze steady and unyielding. "The only thing I'd regret is not taking the chance," he said, his lips curved into a small, reassuring smile. "And if you're having second thoughts—" "I'm not," Mark interrupted quickly, his hand covering Derek's. I want this to last." Derek's expression softened and he leaned down to press a lingering kiss to Mark's temple. "Then we'll make it last," he said simply. The quiet certainty in his voice eased the last of Mark's doubts, and he closed his eyes, letting himself sink into the warmth of Derek's embrace. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or uncertainties they might face, he knew they'd face them together. For now, that was enough.